some people consider him as a sort of father of political science because of his method, because of the fact that he wanted to look at the real life, not imaginary ideas, imaginary states, imaginary republics.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Talk Globally, a podcast on international politics of honor society, Sigma Iota Rho of Webster University. We are here to talk about current events and global politics and want to shed light on various challenges humanity faces. Today, I am very excited to present to you Dr. Piotr Perczynski, a professor of international relations at Webster Leiden campus. In the past, he was head of the advisors for the Polish Deputy Prime Minister and later a diplomat, Vice Ambassador of Poland to the Netherlands, and in 2022, Dr. Perczynski was inducted as an honorary member of Sigma Iota Rho. Dr. Perczynski, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm very much honored, I must say.
The honor is all mine. So today we're going to talk about Niccolò Machiavelli, good old Nick. Arguably the most influential political philosopher, writer, and most importantly, diplomat of the 16th century and modern-day diplomacy. Interestingly, Dr. Perczynski, you were the one who introduced me to Machiavelli. So I think it's appropriate to ask you, who is Machiavelli, and how were you introduced to him?
Thank you. No, actually, I introduced you because you asked me for some books for the summer on political theory. So
That's
I
right.
gave you a list of books. I remember it was a couple of years ago, and you were just very much impressed by the prince. I remember. So yeah, it's nice that I could introduce him to you like this, and I was introduced actually by a very good Polish friend before I started my studies. He knew that I am interested in political theory, so I remember he mentioned that the prince is like a chess guide. I remember this expression, and then later, about 10 years ago, another Dutch friend introduced me to Baltasar Castiglione, who was also a diplomat and writer about the same time as Machiavelli, and through Castiglione, I was sort of reintroduced to Machiavelli. These books are quite similar, and it was really fun to rediscover Machiavelli.
And tell me this, were you introduced to Machiavelli prior to your professional career as a diplomat or afterwards, and how much did he influence you during your career as a diplomat?
Well, it depends which introduction we're talking about. The one that was before I even started my international relations studies, or the second one. The second one was actually while I was a diplomat.
Okay.
This friend thought, let him read Castiglione. I started also to read Machiavelli. I sometimes was even sorry that it was a bit too late. I could have benefited more from especially advice of Machiavelli on diplomacy.
Okay, interesting. So tell me this. He's so polarizing, Machiavelli. But my question to you is, why is he such a global figure, even in 2024, so many centuries later?
Well, he's a global figure because of his influence, I think, on political theory, on political science, because some people consider him as a sort of father of political science because of his method, because of the fact that he wanted to look at the real life, not imaginary ideas, imaginary states, imaginary republics. But we can also say that he was a global, we're talking globally today, right?
That's right.
The name of your show. And he was a global figure, I think, also then. There was like global times, times of discoveries. Discoveries for us, for Europeans. The continents were there, as we know. But interestingly enough, one of the very best friends of Machiavelli, Agostino Vespucci, was a cousin of Amerigo Vespucci, the famous explorer, cartographer that gave his name to the continent, to the two continents actually. They were talking about it. It was the world was shrinking in a way. It was also very interesting that in Europe you had really a big south-north conflict going on. Ottoman Empire was sort of like encroaching into Europe. No one knew how it will end. And Machiavelli was very much interested in Ottoman Empire. He was interested also in Persian Empire, so in the ancient past, in Alexander the Great. So in any case, there was a lot of reasons why we could associate Machiavelli with globalism, with global issues, even though, of course, it is an anachronistic way of looking at it.
Sure. Now, we may have touched on this a little bit from the previous question, but what is the attraction to Machiavelli, and why is it that people admire him so much, especially because he had a lot of things that weren't necessarily good in a lot of his writings. So, but he's still attracting a lot of attention. What is it?
Yeah, I think you are right and you are wrong at the same time, because yes, he's attractive for this bad image. You know, he's like a little bit like a celebrity, like OJ. You know, like someone that you're really fascinated with, but in fact, you know, this person is not so good. But I consider this attraction a little bit misplaced. Machiavelli, if you look even at the dictionary to look what's Machiavellian, it stands for, you know, sneaky, something dishonest, everywhere. You know, that's how he's perceived. But to me, he's attractive, and I think to many, because of his look at politics, because of his beauty of the stuff that he wrote. You know, when you look at when you read The Prince, like you read The Prince, you know how beautifully it's written. It's like a poetry a little bit, and it's not only The Prince. If you look at his letters, even, you know, they are really fantastically written. So you're attracted to this beauty also. There's a fantastic letter of 10th of December 1513 that's considered the most beautiful letter ever written in Italian.
So the thing is, though, he kind of contradicts himself, right? So during his service as an Italian diplomat, he did everything that's kind of opposite of what he writes in The Prince. Why is that? And in fact, who are people more attracted to? The Machiavelli who wrote Prince, or the Machiavelli who was a diplomat and contradicted a lot of his writings?
Well, I think people have no idea, frankly, about his years as a diplomat. Maybe we should at a certain point talk a little bit about his life and explain why he was a diplomat and what was he doing. But to just go back to your question, frankly, I don't see much contradiction there. Because the Prince is, we talk about Machiavelli, the Prince is a very particular book. In fact, it's not a book, it's a treatise. That's how Machiavelli called it. It's a very short book, right? It's about 90 pages. Very, very famous, and everybody knows it. Whereas the diplomatic career, it's mostly forgotten. In The Prince, he's writing really tough. It's like a job application. He wants to go back. We'll say in a moment why he's out. He wants to go back to the real action, to the real life. then you tend sometimes to exaggerate, and as a political advisor, you sometimes also exaggerate. You don't take responsibility, but you just advise. So that's how we should look at it in this context. Whereas in the diplomatic life, he was, realistic. He had to just do his job as good for Florence as possible. So there was no room for some kind of extraordinary actions. Often, that's what you're referring to is probably this idea that, for instance, he never mentions how bad war can be in The Prince. It's wonderful. I just never hesitate. If you hesitate, it will be even worse. War is good. Whereas in his professional life, it was always do anything to avoid war, because the Florence was very sensitive, was fragile, was a very rich city, but didn't have armed forces. So that's why you have just different approach, but it's not a contradiction in my view.
So, for example, when he was in the envoy for the Duke of Valentino, he's sending letters to Florence about paying their debts, and how important it is to hold your word. But in the same breath, in The Prince, he's saying that you shouldn't hold your word as much as, other people do, just because it's human nature for those to be dishonest.
Exactly. The same when he goes exactly at the same mission to Duke Valentino, to Cesare Borgia. He's very much opposite to what he writes in The Prince. That's about having a very powerful ally, right? And here, on the contrary, he says, yes, we need to sign the treaty with Duke Valentino. Is very good for us. Of course, he's powerful and much more powerful than Florence at that time. So yeah, you see here the on one hand just a normal difference between theory and practice. This just doesn't happen so easily. On the other hand, yes, you see that he knows that you need to adjust to the circumstances.
Sure. So maybe it's, well, as we know, his career as a diplomat was fairly short-lived, about 15 years. So maybe some of his writings, correct me if I'm wrong, were written out of hindsight. So he's no longer a diplomat. He's back at his home as a normal citizen.
Yeah.
And he realizes all the things that occurred during his career. And maybe he's looking back on it saying,
definitely,
maybe we went about this the wrong way, and this is how to do it correctly. Is it something along those lines?
Absolutely. Well, we I think need to say that he was not only a diplomat. He was secretary of the second chancellery. So some people called him second chancellor. Quite an important position, even though not really executive. And he was also a secretary to the such a little group of 10 citizens who were in charge of war, in charge of international relations. That's why he was sent with this many missions, about 25.
Sorry to interrupt you, but if you could expound upon second chancellor, what does that mean? What does that title consist of? What is he doing on a day-to-day basis?
Florence was a republic.
Sure.
It was not really very democratic, and the way to get a position was maybe not really transparent and very honest. But in any case, there were large bodies that were governing Florence, and there were two chancelleries. Their duties, in fact, were overlapping. It's very difficult to say, because both of them were, in fact, also dealing with international relations and domestic and so on. But Machiavelli was sent with the missions as a secretary of the second chancellery to many places, to kings, to dukes. I mean, the most important courts in Europe. to negotiate, but not as an ambassador, but as a secretary. It's important because ambassador was a higher position, and you would have to pay more in any case to send an ambassador. But ambassador, on the other hand, had more flexibility, freedom to decide. So he was having a lot of these missions, but at the same time he was having a lot of bureaucratic duties when he was at home in Florence. He had a staff, including this Agostino Vespucci I mentioned, and some other people who were dealing with a lot of issues, everyday issues of Florence. It was very difficult because he was sometimes very long time away, like half a year. It was at the same time delegating a lot of power, a lot of duties to his friends. Difficult issues, but I think most of all he liked the diplomatic part, when he was negotiating, when he was trying to convince the host country to the reasons of Florence.
So you mentioned, just to go back a little bit, you mentioned ambassadors are higher ranking than second chancellor. But in a lot of the readings in the article that you've written, which we'll go on to discuss later, it seems like he has a lot of autonomy to kind of just say or do or whatever he pleases. So explain that to me, because...
Well, it's easy, in fact, to explain, because he was a sole representative of Florence. So he was Florence to Louis XII or Kaiser Maximilian. You know, they were just talking to him and taking for granted everything he said. And I think it was also important that he was such an attractive speaker, you know, that it was like they could see he has something really to say. You can notice this in his letters when he is describing very precisely, verbatim, his talks to very important person. That it mattered, that they were taking this seriously. But then sometimes when it came to the decision, really, the decision from Florence, you would need somebody with a slightly higher position than Machiavelli, like an ambassador. You would say, "Look, I come here. I have, all the credentials. I can sign this treaty."
Another question. So obviously he's working out of Italy, but there's a lot of French that are also involved. So me as an American, I'm curious to know what kind of language. Is there a language barrier between the French and Italians?
Well, Machiavelli was multilingual for sure. At that time, these talks were quite a lot still in Latin. Latin of Machiavelli was superb, even though most probably he didn't go to the university. We don't know very well about his life before he became second chancellor when he was 29. He obviously spoke French. This we know. There is evidence. You wouldn't speak Latin or Italian to the king of France, but yeah, one language he didn't speak, he didn't know, was Greek. This we know. It's one of the indications that probably he didn't go to the university, because at the university then you were obliged to learn Greek. So all the Greek thinkers he's citing from Latin.
So to go back a little bit, you mentioned that there's not a whole lot of information as to how or why he became a diplomat, but maybe you can expand on that and kind of give us more insight.
Why he became a second chancellor? Because being a diplomat was just a byproduct of being a secretary. We can speculate there. In his biographies, almost every biographer has another idea why he became second chancellor. There is no record of him ever working before, He was born into not very wealthy family. His father was a lawyer. His mother wrote poetry. That's an interesting point. We still have this poetry, but very little known about. And then at certain point, he's being, probably because of his literary abilities, and also his father's connections. He's introduced to be a second chancellor, and he's second chancellor. You mentioned, 15 years after stopping, he dies. So he's about 15 years the second chancellor, a diplomat. As we said, traveling to many countries, and then it's collapsing. He is the Republic is collapsing. The Medicis come back. It is year 1512. Machiavelli soon afterwards is imprisoned, and in this prison he's tortured really badly. There are some kind of false accusations. No one precisely knows why. He's very happy of being really tough. He's tortured but not broken, and people were very easily, of course, broken. And then from then on, there is this 15 years. You mentioned that he himself is very upset that he cannot get back to action. He's sort of melancholic, depressed, we could today call it. He's trying to get back, but with less and less conviction that it's possible. But he's writing, and if not this period, we wouldn't have The Prince. We wouldn't have three other books, less famous, maybe less important: The Art of War, the Florentine Histories and Discourses on Levi, and we wouldn't know about Machiavelli. So, in a way, we can say from our point of view, the collapse of the Florentine Republic, that it will be, recovered again into 1527. But Machiavelli was too Republican from the Medici, but he was too the Medici for the Republic, and he was not asked. He was not taken. Soon afterwards, he dies. So this is his life. You can divide into three parts. First, before he's 29, we don't know much, and he's writing some kind of interesting letters on Savonarola and having some contacts. Then this period that we know quite a lot, because there are hundreds of letters, diplomatic correspondence, so-called, but these are mainly letters written to the headquarters. And then this period of that he was so upset, but so lucky for us.
I thought it was interesting how you said he was disappointed that he wasn't in the action, as if he was a part of some military campaign and he had been injured and he could no longer participate.
Good point, because we already said how important war was to Machiavelli. Machiavelli at a certain point was in Florence, sort of having a mission to form the armed forces, militia for Florence. He was obsessed with the idea that they should stop with mercenaries, with auxiliary forces, which they should have their own armed forces. And he was very instrumental, even in one campaign, to a successful campaign, to conquer Pisa. So yes, in action, he was, it was like war, peace, all the time. Things were happening, and he was very flexible, we can say.
He mentions in his book, The Prince, that being trained in the art of war is very important. So my question is, was he trained? Did he have military training? Was he able to participate in combat?
As far as we know, not.
Okay.
And he was taking a lot of his inspiration from the Romans. He was it was very idealistic to think that these people from this militia armed force will fight just for love of Florence. You know? That was his view, and eventually it didn't work well. Eventually, this armed forces turned out to be quite useless. But as I said before, right after they were formed, they conquered Pisa. That was not possible with mercenaries for many years. So yes, he was very much attached. He liked to even take part in some trainings, but he was an amateur, I think. And when it came to show him how it's really done, you know, it was obvious that he's not a professional.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because, as you mentioned, he really liked Alexander the Great, right?
Yeah.
And as we know, Alexander the Great was always a part of conflict. He was always fighting. So again, it's quite interesting. Again, I think a little bit hypocritical. But moving on, an article you published, which I enjoyed reading, you claimed that Machiavelli in real life, in his diplomatic missions, did not follow the principles he preached in The Prince. Was it inconsistency or hypocrisy? But I think we've already answered that.
We answered that. We could sum up by saying that yes, the differences are striking, as you mentioned. Yeah. You know, this is really like you can say, like, what are you preaching? If in the end, well, actually we have to remember it was prior to writing The Prince, right?
That's right.
So he was reflecting on his, let's say, activities, but having completely different conclusions. And this is possible because, think about it, he might change also his mind. He might think like, well, I was in fact advocating to have the Duke Valentino, Cesare Borgia, as an ally, but in reality it could have been very dangerous. And this is what he writes in The Prince. So it's also like reflecting on his professional life, reflecting on his diplomatic life, he might come also to different conclusions.
Sure. Now, you mentioned Duke Valentino. I want to talk about that a little bit and his relationship to Machiavelli. How important was this diplomatic mission, and how pivotal was Machiavelli's personal friendship with the Duke in ensuring the success of his mission?
Yeah, very interesting question, interesting relationship. Maybe I will start by saying that this mission was not so important, you know, because the mission was about, well, first of all, a little bit to spy on Duke Valentino, to see what are his plans. He was very close to Florence, and he was really conquering one papal state, as they called them, then one city state after the other. So they were like, whoops, you know, he's coming our way. So they sent Machiavelli a couple of missions. And in the end, he didn't attack Florence, but I think it was more because of the change of circumstances, not because, you know, Machiavelli convinced him to do it. Machiavelli was rather trying to convince Florence to sign a treaty with.
But when reading your article, it sounds like he had a very close and personal relationship with this gentleman.
True.
That, are you saying that had no impact on the outcome that he received?
I don't know, of course, but I think that the circumstances, the fact that at a certain point the complicated issues, but Cesare Borgia, Duke Valentino, was cut off the funds, you know, just couldn't continue with his campaign, had a bigger impact at that time than the fact that he had such a close relationship with Machiavelli. Indeed, it was close, and it was close till the end, when the Duke was already sort of broken and destroyed in Rome. This relationship, this friendship, had really, as you said, pivotal meaning, pivotal sense for Machiavelli, because he noticed someone who just, makes decisions. And he was fed up with Florence not making decisions, And here was somebody who was, indeed flexible, fast, decisive, all the things that later I associate with Machiavellism, decisiveness, flexibility. Therefore, he is one of the heroes of, as you know, the Prince. The chapter 7 of the Prince is devoted almost entirely to Duke Valentino as an example. You should do it like he did it, even though in the end he was not successful. But it's clearly from both sides. You can see that they really appreciated this contact.
So a lot of the literature on Machiavelli is, some would argue, is still relevant today. And I want to kind of bring up U.S. politics into this whole thing, in particular Donald Trump. And what some would argue is very Machiavellian.
Yeah, but again, Machiavellian in this sense, tricky, dishonest, that I object to. I don't think that Machiavellian means unscrupulous, cunning. This is, like in the centuries, with 500 years, the centuries, especially starting with Shakespeare and his plays, he's very often using Machiavellian in this very tricky sense. I would say, I would use Machiavelli differently as far as the U.S. elections, for instance, are concerned. I would look at one of the candidates as somebody that is projecting himself as somebody who really cares about people, let's say. And if you look at it, it's how he wants to appear. This is very Machiavellian.
That's right. That's right.
This is or for instance, we take let's say another candidate, and we say like that he's just repeating some mistakes again and again and again and again. Yeah? And then you again having this knowledge, let's say from the Prince, you can look at it and think like, how come he's so little flexible? In politics, it's very important. That's what Machiavelli writes many times. The circumstances change, and you must also change. If you stay the same, you lose. We can talk about Dutch politics. There is a very famous politician here, and everybody says like, oh, he's so skillful, negotiating. He might get a position, somewhere else. But then you look with Machiavellian eyes, and you ask yourself what kind of decisions he really made. How decisive he was. It's a very interesting question then, because it's also very important in politics to make decisions. So this I would say yes, but you cannot apply it, blindly without any context. Okay, sure. This is Machiavellian, hurrah! But trying to look into this theory and see, yeah, okay, this might apply if we take the context into account.
Okay. Let's see here. I had another question for you, Dr. Perczynski. I wanted to pull up a quote, but I can't exactly remember which one it was.
Try me. Maybe I can tell you.
Let me see. Because you mentioned it. What was it that you said exactly? That Trump, he presents himself a certain way, right?
Yeah.
And Machiavelli mentions this.
Yeah.
Any leader is supposed to present himself in a specific way, and it seems like he does that. But when you look at, for example, Joe Biden, which you may have alluded to earlier, he doesn't really present that in such a way. Does that have obviously it does, but how does that affect somebody who's potentially voting between or choosing between Trump and Biden when it comes to this presentation.
Yeah, I know what you mean, but then we have to really look not from the Machiavellian original point of view, because this is aimed at the leader, right? At the ruler.
Mm-hmm.
He should appear. It's not important how she or he is. There were, of course, women also that his first mission to Caterina Sforza, a great politician, great leader. So you look like a voter, and you just try to think how much of what you see is the appearance,
Mm-hmm.
and how much not. By the way, I don't know if I completely agree with you on Joe Biden. There is also some attempt to appear the way he wants to be perceived. Sometimes quite successful. It's just completely different from Donald Trump, and there is a slightly different audience. The trick is, I think, to appeal to the audience in between, to try not to convince the convinced one that like this appearance. They say they don't care if it's appearance or not. They want this guy, okay? But there is this group that really looks very critically and saying, like, so which of them is true? Which of them is not pretending?
Mm-hmm.
This is a very big knowledge that the voter can get from the Machiavelli's theory.
If you were to ask me, I would think that they're both pretending at whatever they're presenting, and it's a little bit disheartening. But I can't help but think of many of the things that Machiavelli says about their leaders, right? So now, in your article, you mentioned there are thousands of books written by various scholars on Machiavelli. For someone who is interested in learning more about him, what readings or books would you suggest?
No, but maybe not thousands. Well, actually, I think Asa Berlin mentioned that till 1972 there were like 3,000 books written. So now probably it's doubled. But of course, I think what you mean is like a biography, right? To not
That's
Machiavelli's,
right. Exactly.
Yeah, not Machiavelli's books, but books on Machiavelli, and indeed there are many wonderful books. There is a very old, we can say, biography by Roberto Ridolfi from the 50s, but still excellent. Reads really great. It's rather thick, big book. There is, of course, a biography, but it's more like intellectual biography, but by Leo Strauss, also from the 50s. I was quite influenced, I must say, by this book. There is a beautiful book by Sebastian de Grazia. I believe it's called The Machiavelli in Hell, and it's a book that got a Pulitzer Prize.
Okay.
Written in the 90s. Really, the interesting story. It's really a story on Machiavelli, but you can learn his biography as well from it. There is I would say, very classical biography, quite new, 2011, 2012, of Miles Unger. And this is really a biography, but he clearly understands the theory. With Machiavelli, it's extremely important. There are biographies, but people don't really grasp very well his thoughts. And with Unger, it's different. There's a big part of this biography on his thoughts. Yeah.
There's one thing I think is important to mention is the translation of the books or what Machiavelli has written, because it's my understanding that who is translating it kind of puts their own spin on it. So maybe you can enlighten us on that, because again, I only speak one language, right? So for me,
it's very funny because it looks like we staged it, because I was exactly going to tell you about my two favorite biographies of Machiavelli, and you mentioned a translation which is vital. I believe that my first translation of both Machiavelli and Castiglione were just too old-fashioned even though, of course, very old books. But yeah, it was quite difficult to grasp some thoughts. But the translation I am using for The Prince, I think, really a superb translation, is of Quentin Skinner. It was my I had the honor, pleasure to listen to his lectures in Oxford, but he's a Cambridge man. But he wrote a lot about Hobbes and Machiavelli, and he wrote he translated The Prince, and he wrote a very thin, we can say, biography. This I would recommend to everybody that has absolutely nothing to do with political theory. Even it's in the series of introduction to, if I'm correct, introduction to Niccolò Machiavelli. It is based on Skinner's book in the 80s. Very, very little biography also. And finally, I would very much recommend you, Malcolm, to read a book of Maurizio Viroli. It's a biography. It's called Niccolò's Smile. Niccolò's Smile. Funny, because we don't know how he smiled. Of course, the picture, the painting that we know is drawn, painted 50 years after he died. But it's a very beautiful biography. But it's a lot of translations. You must, when you read The Prince, you must find the one that you like a lot. It is like poetry. I was actually listening to The Prince, read by Ian Richardson, who was the bad guy in The House of Cards, the original version, the British original version. Now this is really like a detective. By the way, the Niccolò's Smile reads also like a detective, even though you know how it ends, but it's very skillfully done.
Well, I've had a pleasure chatting with you today about Machiavelli.
And likewise, of course.
But that's all the time we have today. And again, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Perczynski. And thank you for everyone for tuning in to our episode of Talk Globally. And I hope you enjoyed the podcast. And to be sure to join us on the next one.